Hello again, Fred. Thank you so much for setting up this entire debate format and the idea of your new channel, etc. I really hope it's a major success. It's such a refreshing change, not only in terms of avoiding the whole wrecked and busted and pwned nonsense that infects so many areas, certainly of YouTube, but also in terms of just having the time to think about the arguments, to construct a rebuttal or a response, and instead of being under pressure on the moment where it's very much, if it's in a hangout type thing where you have to come up with your ideas on the spot. And for some of us who aren't that intellectually gifted, that can be difficult at times. So this is really refreshing from so many ways. Anyway, I've eaten into probably 2 minutes of my time already. So let me turn to your initial opening statements. Thank you for that response. I have some difficulties, as you might expect. As you know, I'm not particularly a major fan of Peterson's ideas. I think it's very much and remains strongly of the opinion that it's very much a case of style over substance and emperor's new clothes. But let me tease that out. So I think you've closing comments about truth is myth, and that particularly with religious mythology, and I will use the term mythology, Peterson is arguing that is a higher level of truth because it's a Darwinian truth, as he would put it, that it's helped the species survive and propagate. Yes, I think you've nailed it, that really with that truth is myth or myth is truth statement, that really nails it. I have massive problems with that. Massive problems. So it is a question about empirical versus moral truths, but my question remains, even when it comes to those moral truths, how do I decide? How do I decide? Is there a universal, objective moral truth? Peterson would claim there is. Let's tease that out. One thing you say, of course, slides you can see on the screen at the moment, I will take any opportunity to shoe on an XKCD cartoon. The XKCD is just such a fantastic and very perceptive and witty cartoon strip. You say Peterson vacillates. You use terms like counterintuitive, and it's a hard one to argue. Yeah, I agree, and thank you for taking, playing the devil's advocate or whatever you want to call it here, and taking Peterson's position, because I'd hate to be in your shoes, because absolutely you're right, he vacillates and it's counterintuitive and it's hard to argue. Why is that? Because at core it's entirely lacking in self-consistency to the point of absurdity, for reasons I'll explain. You say that both Harris and Peterson believe empirical facts. I would quibble with that. Peterson may well make that claim. However, he believes, and he said this many times, and it's the whole essence of his belief system, he believes that the moral universe transcends the physical, transcends the physical universe in the context of what we can glean about that physical universe from empirical measurements. That's his stick here. This is what Peterson is saying. And it's not just in the exchange with Harris. You can find it time and time again. Indeed, in the recommended videos, when I watched your video in the panel that YouTube throws up, or the list, you find one with the wonderfully intelligent and perceptive Jordan Peterson roasts Sam Harris. Well, of course he doesn't roast him. He gives a counter-argument that I find entirely lacking in any type of credibility and not at all compelling. Indeed, as you say, Peterson is of the opinion that empiricism has a limited domain. And again, we're back to the question, if we're not basing this on empiricism, how do we justify our beliefs in some other framework? And that question remains hanging in the air and needs to be addressed. Moving on. You say that Peterson is not saying that empirical facts are relative, but he is. He absolutely is. Again, I hate to hark back to this podcast with Harris so often, but it's a great indicator of just where the gaping holes in Peterson's arguments lie. Harris, the rightness or wrongness of the claim is not going to be adjudicated by whether we survive as a species. Yes, this whole effort can be wisely guided or not, but whether it's wisely guided or not does not change the factual legitimacy of any of those claims. Peterson doesn't come back with, yes, yeah, of course, I wouldn't suggest otherwise. He says, yes, it might. So under certain circumstances, the factual legitimacy of the science can be modified by the larger moral or ethical context. That is postmodern to its core. That's precisely what Sakal railed against back in the 90s. Let's focus on this transcendence idea. That video again, and he kicks off, is there a set of ideas that Western civilization is predicated on that are more than opinion? When he talks about more than opinion, he does not mean empirical science or the scientific method. He means a set of values that transcend science. And this is what he means about having his empirical truths nested within moral truths. It's a fundamental, it's a position that is just, as you're finding, impossible to defend because it's riddled with inconsistencies. Again, Peterson, if there's no God, I've added in the disclaimer then as to whether it's God with a big G or God with a small g, because it matters. If there's no higher value, no transcendental value, then you can do whatever you want. That bears remarkable similarities to the type of statements about truth that Christian organisations and churches make all the time. I was brought up, a bit of background here is perhaps helpful. I was brought up in a very strongly Catholic background, very strongly Christian background, Catholic boys' school. When I listen to Peterson, it's like being back at school again. None of this is particularly new. None of this is particularly astounding. None of this is particularly, innovative ways of thinking about moral versus truths versus empirical truths. I find it mind-boggling that Peterson is getting the attention he does for rehashing ideas that are not just decades but centuries old, particularly among an atheist, rational, skeptical, whatever you want to call them, community. It's a fantastic example of the Emperor's New Clothes, rebooted for the 21st century. Remarkable. The ethic, and it's interesting that Peterson uses it in the singular in this video. The ethic that drives our culture is predicated on the idea of God, and it may well be in terms of Western civilization. But that doesn't mean, why would that mean that it's got a greater claim to a higher truth value? There are countless myths out there. How do we decide between them? In terms of the different religious, where I was brought up, we had various sects of Christianity getting very angry with each other about details about whether there was a virgin birth or not. Which myth do we take seriously? You also make this point about the timescales for evolution. And I think this is a fair point because I went back and I've listened to Peterson in a number of different settings. And this is what he seems to be saying, that, as you put it, the evolution of our moral sense is simultaneous with biological evolution. I don't get that at all. I do not get that at all. The timescales are dramatically different. Here's just one example. A fairly topical example and one that's relatively close to my heart. This is the views on same-sex marriage referendum in Ireland a couple of years back. As you can see, there will be a referendum on same-sex marriage next year. How will you vote? 71% yes, allow same-sex marriage, etc., etc., etc. That's a massive evolution in views and morals and ethics and how we view other people and how we interact with other people on the timescale of a generation. One thing I also don't get is your and Peterson's definition or understanding of what is meant by trivial. He keeps saying that the empirical facts about our universe are trivial as compared to the moral universe. Trivial in what sense? I need a definition. I need an understanding of trivial, because for me, the background that I've been using in the other slides is actually a little section of this. Now, you might recognize what's on the screen here at the moment. That's the cosmic microwave background. This is remarkable that our understanding of the universe and the evolution of the universe has got to the point where we can see imprinted in the sky, in the microwaves in the sky, in the universe around us, we can see this pattern that tells us about how the universe came to be. and also connects tiny, tiny quantum fluctuations, at least in our terms of understanding at the moment, to the large scale, to the universal scale, the very, very smallest connected to the very, very largest. It is phenomenal, absolutely phenomenal. How is this trivial? How are these empirical facts? How is the fact that we are small blue furry creatures on Alpha Centauri, if we look up at the sky and we measure in the same way we measure the microwaves, we'll see the same pattern. We'll see it from different perspectives, but we'll see the same pattern. How is that trivial? That's universal. How is it trivial? I don't get it. I don't get how this can be dismissed as trivial, whereas the moral universe somehow holds a higher claim to truth. Don't get it at all. So it's a question of information, misinformation, and as it says there, myth information. I've got to admit I've nicked that myth information term from a conference that's coming up in Milwaukee at the end of this month, which has created a lot of furore. I was involved in a hangout discussion a couple of evenings ago about this, which I've shamelessly plugged there. Sorry. Moving swiftly on. The problem, Fred, is this. If myth is truth and truth is myth, which myths do I choose to get to the truth? Because there are an awful lot of myths out there. And if we're going to say it's the Christian myths and the Christian mythology, how do I even choose within that mythology which aspects of that mythology I should take, which are representative of truth, particularly moral truth? Let's leave the empirical truths to one side and let's think about moral truths. Leviticus is great. Leviticus, as you know, is just a host of wonderful inconsistencies that echo the inconsistencies in Peterson's views. You shall not round off the side growth of your heads, nor harm the edges of your beard. You've got a really fulsome beard. Actually, that video, watching your video, I thought, right, I've got to aim for that. It's a really impressive beard. Does that make you a more moral person than me? In the context, because I have trimmed this off. Admit you've got you've done much less damage and harm to the edges of your beard than I have. Does that make you a more moral person? It might seem like a really pernickety and pedantic and just trivial point, but for me it's not at all trivial. You have to justify your belief. You have to justify your belief in the mythology. You have to justify why a particular mythology has a greater truth value than any other mythology. So this is Leviticus, mythology at its finest. If mythology is truth, then why is it that we are not taking on board Leviticus, and the entire moral and ethical framework of society is not based on, for example, Leviticus? How are we making those decisions? If those decisions to reject, for example, let's take this first passage from Leviticus. For the generations to come, none of your descendants who has a defect, i.e. is disabled, may come near to offer the food of his God. No man who has any defect may come near. No man who is blind or lame, disfigured or deformed. That's our myth. That's meant to be our moral truth. Why have we evolved from that moral truth, and what has justified our rejection of that moral truth, as Peterson would put it? Other examples from Leviticus there. As you know, Leviticus is full of chuckle-worthy examples in terms of a complete lack of morals. So closing this particular round, Fred, comes back to justified belief. We've got a large-scale structure of the universe there. I must admit I've taken that image directly from Wikipedia. Wikipedia's got a great high-resolution image. You can see those speckles. You can see those fluctuations. As I said, that's a universal pattern. You could argue, well, there's different truths in terms of how we interpret those empirical measurements. Absolutely, I agree. We've got something which is called inflation, which is a fairly ad hoc explanation or desperate grasp for an explanation as to how we connect the quantum fluctuations to this large-scale structure. And inflation really was sort of, the idea for inflation in the early universe was sort of plucked out of the air. It works, and it works in many ways, but is it possible that there's something better out there? Yes, of course. But as an empirical fact, that is out there, and it's a universal empirical fact. Let's say I choose a myth. I'm going to pluck a myth that I'm particularly keen on and which I've used before. A great green arcal seizure. Douglas Adams' wonderful creation myth, whereby we were all sneezed out of the nose of the Great Green Arc Crusader. And in fact, you could argue that those little ripples that we see in the microwave background, little ripples, you could argue that looks sort of mucousy, might well be little distributions of snot, etc. That's my myth. If myth is truth and truth is myth, as Peterson claims, then why is my myth not equally valid compared to any other myth? How do we decide? How do we justify our choice? That's my question. Again, Fred, I really look forward to your next response, and thanks again for doing this. I'm hugely enjoying it. See ya.